Hello, this is part 3 of my input system best practices. Make a character controller and take a look at what all of these player input behavior things do. In the first video we went over send messages. Second video we went over invoke Unity events, and now we're going to go over invoke C# events. This video is really for programmers. If you're just interested in the ins and outs of how to set up new actions, probably don't even bother watching this. You will never use this. If you are a programmer and you're thinking about using invoke C# events, this is the least useful of these options. Invoke Unity events is actually more useful, in my opinion. But here we go anyway. Just go over the actions again real quick. We have move, a composite 2D vector with WASDA, jump with a single key bound to it, use with a single key bound to it. Jump has got a press and release trigger behavior. Interaction, which is a press interaction that has a press and release trigger behavior. Use with a hold interaction that triggers after 2 seconds and is bound to the E key on the keyboard. When we are in Unity event mode, these have to be populated. I'm going to unpopulate those. You don't have to, but I'm going to for the sake of this. And then I'm going to switch to invoke C# events. You can only be in one of these modes at a time, so there we go. Going to open up our character controller input. And we're going to do the same thing we did in the previous videos. We're going to go over how to use this option for player input. And the first thing we have to do, because it's a C# event, is subscribe to the C# event. I'm going to make an assumption that this game object has a player input component on it, and it has a few events, on device regained, on device lost, on controls changed. You can do all this for Unity events as well. And on action triggered is the new one. The wording here is bad. Triggered is a word that you use when you're trying to figure out whether or not an action was triggered, meaning that it met its interaction requirements. That is not what this triggered means. On action triggered event in this context means any event coming off of that action, which means started, performed, canceled. Whether the action triggered property is true or false, it does not matter. It will be called. I'm going to call this function on action triggered. Call this context. And then similarly, I'm going to debug out exactly what this thing is saying, and we don't know at this, context knows what action it came from, but we don't have any implicit separate events or messages to figure out which one's which. So after I'm done debugging this out, we're going to have to make a switch case that then routes the events out to the proper functions, or we can just do everything inside on action triggered. Okay. Context.action.name, so we get our name back. Phase, context action triggered, and then the value we can get back with context.read value as object, because we have no idea what it's supposed to be. It's actually not totally true. I think you can get a value type as well, and that comes back as an actual system type. So that can help you when you have to write your giant action routing thing after this. Okay, so back into play mode, character won't move, but we'll see exactly what's going on in here. I'm going to push the W key for forward, and we get 2 events. Move phase started triggered false. Value set shows the button is pressed. Move phase performed. Trigger is true, meaning the action has actually been performed and triggered. The interaction has been properly triggered. And the button's still pressed, we release, we get another one which is canceled, which sets the value back to 0. Again, it's important to note that if you don't listen to more than just the performed phase, you will never get a 0 out of a vector 2, or a button that does not have press and release. The canceled event is what gives you that information. The jump button is configured as a press and release, which means we should get 2 performed. One when the button becomes true, one when the button becomes false. So we also get our started, in which case triggered is the on-triggered action, the on-action triggered event sends, it invokes the event during phase started when the action triggered property is false, gives you the button, then gives you jump phase performed with a trigger value of true and a value of 1, and when we release we should get another performed with triggered true because the interaction was set to press and release with a value of 0 because the button was released this time, and then we get a canceled in which triggered is also true, which I think is not correct in my mind, but because release is one of the interaction conditions, it technically triggered during that part of the input system, but the button is 0. I said it in the previous video, but what you really want to listen to is in the case of buttons, is the performed event when value is either 1 or 0. And I strongly advise you actually put the press and release interaction on your button. It just makes it sound way more useful when it comes out of your mouth when you're trying to talk about this to people. And then the hold action works about the same way. Push it down, wait 2 seconds, you get the performed, you release, you get the canceled. To use this correctly, in my mind, this is where we get into switch context action name case move, and we can just reuse the things we had before. Jump. Just pass the context on down the line. I think I actually named this function on hold. There we go. And I'm going to comment out this debug log just for the sake of this video, because we should still see our debug logs from the other functions. Hit the go button. Same idea, the character is working now, and it properly forwards the context callback to the right function. So this is the way of doing the code thing if you don't want to use Unity events, but you could also just add listeners with code instead of writing a non-strongly typed switch case to figure out which action was which. Someone might comment about this saying that you could actually have a public input action reference, and then you could just check whether or not the context action was equal to the move action reference action. I think this is really roundabout, and it actually breaks down because player input actually instantiates a copy of your input action asset when you do things like local multiplayer using player input manager. That is all I am ever going to say about invoke C# events. Probably don't use it. I'm going to cover doing this I'm a programmer and I don't need no component to help me do all this event routing stuff in the next video. All right, see ya.